Is there a shadow biosphere? Could we even know? That is the question I want to look at today on Science Spotlight number 10, the shadow biosphere. Let's get right into it. So let's introduce the shadows biosphere. It'd be helpful to have a definition. It's a decent one for Britannica. The shadows biosphere is a hypothetical life-supporting system on Earth consisting of microorganisms of unique or unusual molecular structure and biochemical properties that representing the possibility that life on Earth originated more than once. So they're not confirmed real life, but hypothetical life that maybe originated so far deep back in time that it was a different biogenesis. Sometimes shadow biospheres, shadow microbes are called non-standard, alternative, exotic, or weird life. And now, some related topics to the shadow biosphere, to shadow life, would be astrobiology, because you think of astrobiology as looking at alien life, so life on other worlds, which would by definition not have, for the most part, with some exceptions, not have the same genesis of life as life on Earth. So shadow biosphere is like that, only the life, the weird life, the alien life is right here among us on Earth. Another really topic I would say is archaea and microbial dark matter, because and we'll get into some softer definitions later, but archaea, was once unknown and just thought to be regular bacteria. It turns out not the case. It was more divergent than bacteria. In fact, mostly more closely related with eukaryotes. In fact, eukaryotes probably came from archaea, but that's a tangent for another time. And then microbial dark matter, just in general, a lot of microbes can't be cultured, so we only know their sequencing information. And there could be microbes that we see under the microscope that we can't sequence and might actually be, in fact, from the shadow biosphere if it indeed exists. Now, the shadow biosphere is a very niche topic. I could really only find a few articles, mostly all from Wikipedia, though branching out somewhat to find some more. In fact, probably the most mainstream source for the shadow biosphere is a mention in XKCD. So we're kind of going off the deep end here when we're talking about interesting scientific spotlights. So with that, let's get into a series of papers, which I lump under the topic of foundational musings. These are the earlier papers that kind of go through this. A lot of them seep into metaphysics or philosophy. So the earliest one I could find that I think even had the term microbial dark, or not dark matter, shadow biosphere is the article A Molecular View of Microbial Diversity in the Biosphere. It was from 1997 by Norman Pace, bringing up a lot of interesting points about microbes. Before molecular sequencing, most of microbial biology was unknown. It turns out to be very vast. We have bacteria, archaea, single-celled eukaryotes, and they do all sorts of different things. They utilize all sorts of different food sources with their metabolism. In fact, lithotropic metabolism, that is from inorganic sources, may actually be the dominant form. And that's very different from what we think of when we think of uh, utilization of metabolism. And, we're learning more and more every passing year about these microbes, bacteria. Back in 1997, mentioned even the doubling of whole entire bacterial kingdoms in less than a decade, from 12 to 25 to 30. Now that's even much higher, especially with sort of metagenomic sequencing. And so he kind of brings up some intriguing questions. Are there deeper branches in the tree of life than the lineages we know? And so that would be, um, is there like sort of a shadow biosphere that we haven't detected yet? A very weird life, um, even more divergent than the microbes we've already found. And so his take-home point was, actually, much of the microbial life we know today from modern sequencing would have been the shadow biosphere in the past. So it's not strange to think about things still yet to be discovered. That brings up an important distinction when he talks about deep branching, etc. Is two definitions that I think come up with the shadow biosphere, which I want to elucidate here. There's the hard definition and the soft definition. The hard definition of the shadow biosphere of shadow microbes is that they actually come from a different tree of life, unrelated to standard life we know today. That is, there are multiple genesis of life in the early Earth, and the shadow biosphere came from a different tree of life. So it's not even related to life we know of today, standard life. However, that's not the only definition. There's a softer definition, which is like a deeply diverging branch of of life. So they're actually on the same tree of life as us and everything else we know, bacteria, archaea, etc. They're just really deeply diverging standard life, and that would include sort of remnants of early forms of life that may still exist today or could still exist today theoretically. So moving forward, that's the hard and soft definition of the shallow biosphere. So continuing on with our musings, there is this article in 2004 about common chemical model for life in the universe by Brenner, Ricardo, and Kerrigan. And, bringing over like what sort of requirements are there for life, chemical life? Some absolute requirements was a thermodynamic disequilibrium and a temperature consistent with the chemical bonding. If you They threw out some weaker requirements that may not actually be required of life. We know that they're required of life as we know it, but perhaps not as we know it. Things like solvent systems, certain elements, certain thermodynamic features, and also the opportunity for isolation. So like some sort of cell wall, cell membrane. And while life we know it on Earth requires water, that might not be true of all life, but if white life indeed does need water, there would be some water-based criteria like soluble metabolites, genetic materials with between charges, and a well-defined temperature range. They end with very shadow biosphere questions. So, does an alternative or shadow biosphere exist on Earth? And in fact, maybe do RNA organisms still exist on Earth? Because one of the a strong theory for early life is that it started out in RNA, so RNA organisms, before switching over to DNA and protein sort of dominant. And so early RNA organisms, perhaps they still have survive somewhere. No, they would not be the hard definition of shadow biosphere, but they would be the soft definition. And now some of these sort of the idea about an alternative biosphere is not as crazy as it thinks, because again, going back to Archaea 50 years ago, that wasn't even recognized as a separate grouping. Life in the ocean 50 years ago, deep in the ocean, was not well known or even known at all. And still today, most microorganisms cannot be cultured. And so it's not inconceivable that there could be an alternative biosphere. And even RNA organisms still existing, they would be hard to detect because our universal sort of molecular probes target the ribosome. RNA organisms would not have a ribosome, that's proteins. And so they could be in potential environments that standard life couldn't be in, like environments depleted of sulfur, very small space constrained environments like submicron pore, minerals with submicron pore sizes, even elements that cycle between high and low temperatures, because RNA can denature and refold better compared to proteins. Then in 2005, there's this hypothesis paper finding a second sample of life on Earth by Davies and Lineweaver, and we'll see Davies show up again. Big question in this hypothesis was, did life arise more than once? So is there a shadow biosphere? Now, they would call that the second sampling of alien life. Now, some interesting hypotheses would be that, okay, did life arise more than once? Well, how could that happen? One, yes, but it was wiped out really quickly, so it's just hypothetical. There's no way we could know about it. Two is that it survived for an extent and then died out, and perhaps maybe we could then find that in the fossil record. Three would be currently surviving, so there's currently a shallow biosphere, and so we should be able to detect that if we find the tools. And then four, even more intriguingly, that it's actually currently arising. That if life could arise more than once in the deep past, maybe it's arising even as we speak, sort of recently, geologically speaking. And then they went through some scenarios of how life different samples of life might have come about. There could have been multiple starts with non-living to living, multiple starts with a swapping and merging, that is, like sort of horizontal gene transfer between different trees of life. A single start, but radical divergence. So that would be more like the soft definition. That maybe there's radically diverged, but still in the same tree of life shadow organisms, whereas the first and second one are more like the hard definition. And then there could be a combination. Another paper here by Cleland and Copley in 2006, the possibility of alternative microbial life on Earth. Started out by talking about Luca. So Luca is the last universal common ancestor, and so everything is descended today from that, but it wasn't the first. It was among other organisms. So maybe there was other, sort of trees of life and living organisms from other trees of life arrive at the same time of Luca that left no descendants. And then the authors start to go into what alternative life could look like. It could have different nucleotide or amino acid types or even configurations, especially chirality, because it turns out that conventional life uses actually L amino acids versus D amino acids, where L is levo and D is dextro. And so so conventional life chose one side, one-handedness, one chiral position, but maybe it could have chosen another. Maybe there's other lives that did choose that and no longer are with us. And so, yeah, shadow microbes could be microbes that resemble archaea or bacteria in gross morphology. So you look under a microscope, but it turns out they're fundamentally different on the molecular level. And it'd be really hard to detect that because we don't have the tools we might not have the tools for detecting them. We don't know what we're looking for. And so alternative life could coexist in the biosphere or reside in parallel biosphere, be places where standard life could not exist. And again, because um, shadow life could be fundamentally different at a molecular level, our tools for exploring microbial life, so microscopy, cultivation, PCR, couldn't distinguish or even detect shadow life if it was different enough. And so they thought of the shadow biosphere as a paradigm shift and it really would require new detection methods to detect it. So 2007, Cleland wrote a solo paper on epistemological issues in the study of microbial life, alternative terran biospheres. So arguing against the common assumption that there is no alternative shadow life. So kind of relaxing that sort of baseline assumption and really getting to the point that life as we know on Earth might not represent life in general. There might be a broader characteristics of life. And so if we're trying to find shadow, weird, non-standard life, we need to widen our net, widen our understanding. And there could be made of non-standard shadow life could be made of alternative proteins, amino acids, or even neither. Maybe they're silica based. Maybe they're based in an entirely other system. And however, sort of tempering that a little bit, it's one thing to claim multiple early forms of life, in the deep past, another to claim current persistence. So you need to actually have evidence. However, there's something very interesting. We know of non-cellular entities that aren't living per se, or most biologists don't think they're living, but they have lifelike functions. So that's like viruses, prions, plasmids. And so this actually suggests that not all microbial life may be cellular. So we might need to look for life in a non-cellular setting. And she closes with a very interesting candidate for like potentially the shadow biosphere is actually something called desert varnish. So this is found on some rocks in the desert, and it's essentially higher concentration of certain metals than what's found in the actual rocks. And so um, thought that maybe it's a biological process, though sequencing of this haven't really found a smoking gun when it comes to conventional microbes. So perhaps maybe they're being deposited by, shadow microbes. So candidates like that could be places to look. All right. Now let's get into, I think, something that really can't be covered with the shadow biosphere. Um, Something that needs to be covered when we talk about the shadow biosphere is what I call the arsenic controversy. So Felisa Wolf-Simon, Paul Davies, and Ariel Anbar had this sort of hypothetical paper in 2009 called Did Nature Also Choose Arsenic? We talked about phosphorus. It was a necessary element for life, and phosphorus scarcity. That's a common growth limitation. And now arsenic is chemical consumer to phosphorus, and it's actually toxic because it can substitute for phosphorus. But perhaps there could be organisms that instead of it being toxic, they actually incorporate and use arsenic instead of phosphorus for some of their functions. So that would be arsenic-based life. And so the paper kind of goes through, well, in the past, was there arsenic-based life, or could there even be arsenic-based life in the present? And that would certainly be a shadow biosphere candidate, a type of weird life. They even have some sort of hypothetical examples of molecular biomolecules that have arsenic instead of phosphorus. And now, this wasn't a controversy for this paper. It was actually the paper, actual experiment or the observation that followed. It's called, this was published in Science, called A Bacterium That Can Grow by Using Arsenic Instead of Phosphorus. So, lead author, Felisa Wolf-Simon, 2009. And they described that they, in fact, did find a bacterium, strain GFAJ1, which, interestingly enough, is an acronym for Give Felicia a Job. And they found this bacteria in Mono Lake, California, and they claimed that it was able to substitute arsenic for phosphorus to sustain its growth. So that would be example of an organism that's able to use arsenic instead of phosphorus, which was sort of unheard of at the time. And so that was, you know, announced, and very quickly it generated a lot of controversy, a lot of backlash. And actually, in fact, it was just earlier this year was retracted from Science. And now, here's just some summary of sort of the reasoning for it. So, Science did publish in 2011, the print version with technical comments, so people commenting that, technical response from Wolf Simon, and then an editor's note, and then the next year publishing two papers that failed to reproduce the finding. And so, there's certainly been, a lot of back and forth, a lot of controversy. And now Science did say, going into more details, that they don't think there was deliberate fraud or misconduct. They maintain that view, but sort of their standards for retracting papers has expanded, and so they think that meets that extended diff criteria, and so they decided to uh, retract it. And so, I don't actually know for sure, what all went on. Certainly a lot of controversy. In fact, Felicia is no longer currently practicing science. Um, but I guess the thing here is that, it was probably over eager presentation, and the fact that uh, other people were unable to reproduce the finding really kind of dampens the plausibility of this. Now, maybe more data comes out later showing this isn't the case, but at this point, the very radical, very bold claim that arsenic bacteria can use arsenic instead of phosphorus has not been substantiated. All right, with that, I think that maybe in part the arsenic controversy, why some of this isn't as well studied, or really is a very niche topic, but I thought we needed to cover that. And so let's kind of move on to some of the more recent papers, which I'm grouping under signatures and searches. So Paul Davies kind of goes on with other co-authors in another hypothesis article in 2009. Just as an aside, Paul Davies is an astrophysicist active in SETI research and would kind of consider himself an armchair astrobiologist. So that's why he's interested in shadow biosphere. So, the author, Davies and the authors talk about weird life on other planets, so astrobiology, well considered, but the question, like, well, what about weird life on Earth? That's the shadow biosphere. Something that comes up, life as we don't know it, that kind of that phrase. And now they bring up that, there's different relationships, ecological relationships between the shadow biosphere and regular biosphere. They can be totally ecologically separate. So the shadow biosphere is only in places that the regular biosphere can't be. They can be integrated ecologically, so sort of right on top of each other, and they can even be biochemically integrated. And table one, we'll look into more detail of different search locations, possibly for shadow life. They bring up signatures of life that you need to maybe look at to find the shadow biosphere structure, function, molecular composition. Though they bring up a lot of issues of like how hard it would be to actually find this. Low signal to noise ratio. We probably have too narrow of a molecular net, and we're not even sure if shadow biosphere would be that soft. So that soft definition, so an early branch, or the harder definition that like a second or different tree of life. And other sort of grab bag of ideas from this paper that I want to sort of quickly go through. Um, a very interesting indirect method for detecting shadow biosphere might be if we find viruses that are maladapted to known life, perhaps they are parasitizing the shadow biosphere. So maybe they're shadow biosphere with shadow viruses. And maybe we could detect the viruses and therefore kind of lead us towards detecting the shadow biosphere. Now, how high altitude might be a good place to look for them, shadow biosphere, because ultraviolet radiation is sort of lethal to known life, and so maybe shadow microbes were able to adapt to that in the high atmosphere. Another thing would be survival of the RNA world would be weird, but not alternative in the hard sense. That would be a deeply branching, deeply diverging early branch. And then, kind of finally, that, the anomalies drive scientific evolution. So even if we fail in a search for the shallow biosphere, it should be worthwhile in trying to drive innovation, drive revolution. All right, so like I said, go look at that table a little bit more. Some search locations for shadow life would, the first form would be environments with little or no standard life, so very dry, cold, hot. Um, Extreme environments. That would be places. But you also think of artificial environments, where you specifically introduce toxins specific to DNA life, remove phosphorus and other vital element, specifically have high temperature or replace water with a different solvent. Um, and then in a solo review paper in 2011, Davies had the Searching for Shallow Biosphere on Earth that tested the cosmic imperative. So kind of falling back more on his astrophysicist um, background. So the origin of life probability, range from 0 to 1, is important for something called the Drake equation. If you're not familiar with that, that is um, sort of an estimation of the number of communicating civilizations in the galaxy. And you multiply a bunch of probabilities together, and now um, the fraction of Earths where life developed is a real clinching number. Now the higher up ones are mostly about um, sort of cosmological, and we have a fairly good estimation of some of those fraction of stars, Earth-like worlds, etc., etc. And then the bottom ones are more about cultural probabilities, and I think we have a fairly decent handle on that. But the fraction of Earth where life developed is the real clinching point, and that can really throw things one way or the other. And now, on one side of the people who think that this number is essentially one would be the cosmic imperative people who think life is essentially bound to arise with Earth-like conditions, whereas someone who thinks this is maybe very close to zero or zero would be more that sort of life is very improbable or almost miraculous. Now, it's interesting. He kind of goes into some of the history of this. A scientific belief in extraterrestrial life was, nonsense 75 years ago, but now it's essentially mainstream. And he asks kind of why. Throughout some common reasons given that, we know a lot more, that there's a lot more exoplanets, that amino acids have been found in space, that water is essential for life on Earth, and we find a lot of water in the galaxy, so maybe we can follow the water, or even the fact that we know life is know much more about extremophiles and the range of sort of temperatures and conditions that life can survive here on Earth. So, but he says that none of those things really seem to drive that. He probably thinks that's actually more likely a fashion of thinking. So not so much scientific, but sort of philosophical. Anyways, and sort of where you fall in the camp of whether life is very probable or not on other worlds kind of comes down to what do you think if life is chance like, so that's like the improbable, or law life, like the cosmic imperative. Though again, he says the sentiments on the matter are more philosophical than scientific. So we're kind of treading into um, sort of philosophical speculation rather than scientific um, data. But and he does say that finding a second sample of life, so the shallow biosphere, or not even the shallow biosphere, just second sample anywhere, it doesn't clinch the cosmic imperative. because some people think that, well, if we found life on Mars, that really shows that life can arise anywhere. But actually, turns out that life on Mars, um, Mars and Earth can actually exchange rocks, and that microbes can looks like they can actually survive impact and survive space. And so, actually, if there's life on Mars, it might actually have originated from Earth or vice versa. So, it actually Mars and Earth might just more be one more extended biosphere. And then also, if scientists were able to create synthetic life in the lab, that's interesting, but that doesn't really tell us about how life arises in the universe because um, that's directed. That's not um, sort of that. Yeah, that's a directed process of life. Just like how a good example is plastics are really easy to make in the lab, but we don't find them in nature. And then I guess to close out this review, there's going to be to identify intermingled weird life, so that is the shallow biosphere that is ecologically concurrent with standard life. You need to do something like filter out standard life or make an educated guess about weird life signatures and be able to actually develop tools to detect those signatures. And that's not particularly easy. So, kind of getting to our last little section here, the most recent articles I could find, just a couple here, really showing how much we don't know. This is why I call the section Steps into the Dark. So, we have an article called The Shallow Biosphere Hypothesis, Non-Knowledge in Emergent Disciplines by Valentina. It's actually a philosophical paper. So, philosophy, again, rears its head. We're dealing with a lot of non-knowledge, a lot of unknowns. So a lot of this ends up becoming speculative, philosophical. Um, so in her paper, she talks a lot about the strategic role of non-knowledge claims, bringing up the arsenic microbe by Felicia Wolf Simon, sort of as a starting point. She talks a lot about black boxes in science. That is a concept or artifact that hides the complexity of knowledge. Because like to figure things out, things are really complicated. You have to go through a lot of steps and go through a lot of things to prove it. But then once you kind of prove it, you kind of put it in a black box and it sort of just works. So you don't have to open up the complexity anymore. But that might not always be the case. You might actually have to open black boxes back up to actually figure out what's going on. That maybe it isn't as simple or as solved as you think it is. One example, definitely goes into the shallow biosphere is spontaneous generation. In the couple of centuries ago, that was sort of disproven that spontaneous generation could occur. People thought that could for a while. You had microbes could sort of spontaneously arise, but then they did experiments, with a sealed, sterile container, and microbes couldn't arise. But then if expose to the environment, they could. However, so that new idea sort of raises a head because then you think of like the shallow biosphere of multiple trees of life. It's like, well, that is spontaneous generation, and living from non-living, and we really don't actually know how that happens. And so, I think we need to be careful about how many black boxes we create and how solved we really think some of these situations are. And so if you're going to search for something like shadow life, it's good to keep an eye open for anomalies, for where things aren't so neat and tidily and figured out, because that's probably where um, new knowledge, new solutions, new understandings will come from, is these anomalies that don't fit into a box. And then finally, 2024 paper, on a series of chapters, and chapter 9 was of this group was called Life as We Don't Know It. It's really about, again, the shallow biosphere or the broader view of life. It's really starting to elucidate unknown unknowns. That, living things, that life may be a lot broader than we think of it. We only have a sample of one life on our planet. And so a key to like understanding what life looks like anywhere is going to be that life is going to be a complex system. And so we can't just think of our particular sampling of life. We have to think of a life in general, and so it's going to be a complex system, and we need to think about detecting properties of complex systems. And then they go into like how life could be different, how it could be non-carbon, it could be made of silicon, boron, metal oxide, sulfur. It could not need water as a solvent. Maybe it uses ammonia, sulfuric acid, formamide, etc. It could have alternate compart compartmentalization. So maybe it has a life on other planets, or a shallow biosphere has a non-lipid membrane. It has membranes, but they're not made of lipids like ours are. Maybe it doesn't have membrane compartments at all. Maybe it's not even compartmentalized at all. It could use alternative energy sources like thermal gradients, gravitational energy, radiation energy, or even osmotic gradients. There could be alternative information systems like other genetic codes, other informational polymers, so not DNA or RNA, or maybe even a non-polymer-based genetic system altogether. And so at the end of it, you're going to need to have an agnostic biosignature detection. That is, biosignatures that don't depend on specifically the life we think of. It could detect life however it's set up. And these could be chemical, structural, morphological, physical, or energy and metabolism biosignatures. All right, so let's look at these great little pictures here from this chapter, looking at sort of sketches of hypothetical organisms using these different energy sources. We have on the left here a thermotroph, which uses thermal gradients to generate energy. There's a mechanotrope, which uses sort of mechanical forces to generate energy, and even osmotrophs that use sort of salinity gradients to generate energy. And then finally, here's some of the proposed agnostic biosignatures. A would be, if you find molecular complexity, there's probably life there. If you have fingerprinting surface complexities, you have a very specific, one molecule that really specifically fits into another molecule, sort of like a locking key, that's probably biological. If you see energy metabolism happening, or if you see very specific structural or morphological arrangements, specific chemicals, minerals, elements sort of arranged in a non-random way, in a very specific way, that might be a signature of life. All right. Well, with that kind of close here, I would say, there's a lot we don't know about the shallow biosphere. In fact, that it's just a theory, and no one has actually ever really detected it. And those who have claimed to, there's certainly been a lot of backlash. So where do we go from here? One thing I thought of, like, well, maybe there is some sort of gray literature I could look at it with the shallow biosphere. So I looked the term shallow biosphere on bioRxiv, the preprint server for biology, as well as the more general archive preprint server, and I didn't find any results. So there's really not a lot known. People really aren't studying this. And so it's good to realize that we really don't know what a shallow biosphere could look like. We have some ideas, but until we would actually detect it, even if it even exists, we don't know. So unknown unknowns are, by their very nature, unknown. So it's good to realize our lack of knowledge. And that, especially from like the arsenic controversy, is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So we need to be really careful about, proving or really showing the evidence if we have very strong claims. And finally, to look for this, we want to stay curious. We want to look for anomalies. We want to find things that don't fit into the standard theories, and try to dig more, see if we can make discoveries, maybe lighten the shadows somewhat. With that, thanks for joining me. Here's all the references. I should also be found in the links to this video, or the description to this video. That's all I have. Thanks so much for joining me. Hopefully the idea of the shallow biosphere was fascinating to you as it was to me. And please let me know what you liked about this, any questions, anything you want to know more about, and definitely what topic in Science Spotlight should I cover next. You can like and subscribe, and have a great day.